Well, hey, Sea Lifers, we are in week 2 of our Change the World series, and so we're glad that you're joining us. And I am here with Dr. Joe Paris.
Dr. J.
Dr. J.
I'm trying to get that going.
Dr. J, you're trying to get that going.
Wasn't great at basketball, but
how's it working?
It's not.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
This is it.
Anyway, all that to say, we are wanting to discuss the second week of our Change the World series. And so this week we talked about our foundation. I love the verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, and it says it this way. It says, "For no one can lay a foundation other than what is being laid, which is Jesus Christ. And if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each builder's work will be plainly seen, for the day will make it clear, because it will be revealed by fire. And the fire will test what kind of work each has done. If what someone has built survives, he will receive a reward. If someone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss. He himself will be saved, but only as through the fire." Yeah. And so we talked about that verse, Joe, in light of the fact that what we're doing with our life needs to matter.
Yeah.
And we don't want to get through our life and have only built things with wood, hay, and stubble. We want to have built things that last. And so all this to lay a foundation, really, no pun intended, but we're laying a foundation for really how we are going to change the world is through our sacrifice, through our giving. Yeah. And so the Bible's got a whole lot to say about giving. I know you have been extremely involved in Dave Ramsey's.
So I've been heading up FPU, Financial Peace University, our Dave Ramsey course for 2 years now.
Yeah.
And so that's grown. And I think our first year we had 180 people sign up for that. And because it's a felt need for a lot of our people.
Sure.
I mean, they're asking that question of, I want to be faithful. But I think maybe the reason that Jesus spoke about this so much is because we all struggle with it. I mean, there's so much that's tied into finances and money and being a giver. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. So give me, as we just talk about this, and I know there's lots of practical things in the Dave Ramsey thing, and that's not really so much what we're about talking about today. But what are a couple of the overarching spiritual principles that you've seen in that class?
I think one of the things that we talk most about is that a lot of times when we talk about finances or budgeting or church and kind of giving back, it feels almost like an obligation. And what Dave really talks a lot about, and we try to encourage, is
you call him Dave.
I call him Dave. But I mean, we want to see it as what it is. It's an opportunity to be a part of something. Right. And so I think a lot of times you can feel like, oh, I ought to do this. And what we really like to say is, no, you get to be a part of this. That at the end of your life, it's not going to be about stuff. It's not going to be about money. It's going to be about, did I do something that mattered? And that's what we really try to encourage people to see the positive and not the negative side of it. Because I think a lot of times it feels oppressive. And the people that have gone through our course, they have so much freedom. They're just like, man, I sleep better. I feel better. I know what I'm doing with my finances. And so they talk about it with a sense of excitement, not a sense of like, oh, I survived. It's like, I'm so excited for where God has me.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So is there an overarching principle or that you would say really summarizes what you learned through that class?
Yeah, I think it's just being diligent and thinking ahead. I think many times we're reactive, and so it's like, oh, I've got to do this because I already made this decision. And one of the things that he talks a lot about is just count the cost. I mean, he talks about that kind of that proverbial story of, nobody builds something without counting the cost first. And I think a lot of times when it comes to finances, we're more of like, oh man, how much did I spend last month? Oh, I didn't know it was that much. And he really talks a lot about, hey, think ahead, give every dollar a name, give every paycheck a purpose, and so that's what we truly try to encourage our people is to think ahead, not to react to the situations that are around you.
Yeah. Through the years, as we've talked about giving, one of the things that I've found to be most important is just a general baseline understanding of this idea of stewardship. Yeah. That when you really get down to it, I love what it says in Psalm 24:1. It says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." Yeah. And really, when you start to think about it, I think that's when people's lives really begin to shift, when they begin to see the stuff that comes into their lives, not really as belonging to them, but as stuff that belongs to the Lord, and they're just managers of it or stewards of it, And so, at a restaurant, a steward is a person who brings the meal. Their job is not to cook the meal. Their job is to manage the meal, to make sure that it gets to the place the way the chef intended. Yeah. And as individuals, our job really is to be stewards of
Yeah.
what God gives us. So are there some ways that you've seen that apply to people's lives?
Well, and I think I heard this illustration once that if somebody were to ask me to hand over $100 from my paycheck, I would probably have to think about that. Like, I'd be like, that's $100. But if somebody's like, hey, Paul wants you to give $100 from his paycheck, that's not a problem for me, because I realize it's not mine. And I think we get so locked up because we think of it as our paycheck, our money, our possessions. And when you switch it in your head and you realize you're just a steward, it's not hard for you to transfer money to another account. It's not hard for you to give it to somebody else, because you have a proper understanding it's not yours.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Yeah, it would be like if you went to a money manager.
Yeah.
If you have a money manager, if you go to a money manager and the first thing he tells you about is what all he wants to do with your money, you need to change managers.
Yeah, exactly.
You want to go to a money manager, and the first thing that he ought to ask you is, okay, Joe, tell me about your plans for your money. What is it that you want to see accomplished?
Yes.
And then he ought to be able to give an accounting for what he does with that money.
And he has no really, he's following your wishes and desires because it's not his money. It's not his. He's recognizing he is just a steward of what he's been given. So,
Yeah, that's good. That's good. I think if we can learn to view our resources that way, that hey, they don't end with us. Our job is not to pull them or collect them. Our job is to be conduits of God's resources.
Yeah.
And so we ought to be asking the owner, God, what do you want me to do with your money? And then we ought to be able to account for it. Like, hey, what did I do with that? And
but I think that even goes back to, what we talked about a couple months ago with mindset, is that a lot of times people think, hey, I'm going to do it, and then my mindset's going to change. And what we would say is, no, I'm going to change my mindset, and because I change my mindset, my actions are going to follow necessarily. And so some people may be saying, hey, man, I hear this message, but I'm going to get some things figured out, and then I'll change. And what we would say is, no, it's a decision you make. You choose to be a steward of God's resources, and from that becomes the outflow of it. And so we've got to change your mind first.
Yeah, that's good. And so the way that we're trying to talk about this for everybody to just get a grasp on, throughout the Old Testament, there was this idea of the tithe, and there's lots of debate about how that changed in the New Testament.
Sure.
Is that still applicable? And I would say that generally we would want to hold on to the belief that, hey, the tithe becomes a minimum standard for God.
Absolutely.
And so, the really simple way to illustrate it is, what do you do with your money? So if you get $10, you say, hey, one of these, I go give that straight back to God. One of these I save, and then I get to spend $8. And I think we miss out on the reality of the truth of that when we go, oh my gosh, I've got to give God $1. I've got to give back $1. Rather than to see that as, man, God has blessed me with this, and I get to live off of 8 of these dollars.
Yeah.
And I know that, obviously Dave Ramsey's huge on that what gets mixed up in there is when you don't prioritize those things, when you start living off of the 10 or sometimes 11 or 12.
Many times that's the problem, is that you're living off the 11 and the 12, and when you get that first paycheck, it's already spent. And so you're not even getting to enjoy giving back to what God is doing, because you feel so burdened by the decisions you've made, by poor stewardship of your resources. So you're going, gosh, I'd love to give, but I just don't have anything. I'm a debtor to these other people, and so it's this terrible cycle that people find themselves in all the time.
Yeah, so. There's a couple of verses that we mentioned on Sunday that I think are worth mentioning here. There's Proverbs 11, 24 and 25, and it says this, it says, one gives freely, yet grows all the richer. Another withholds what he should give, and only suffers want. And then it says in verse 25, whoever brings blessing will be enriched, and one who waters will himself be watered. And then in Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9, it says, honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of your produce. Then your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. And so, we're not a health and wealth church. We're not a name it, claim it church. And so I don't think that means, hey, you give to God and you can just sit around waiting for the envelope in the mail that's going to have 3 times what you gave coming back to you. But I think it does teach us, the Scripture really does teach us that stewardship is a part of trusting God with your life. And what we do know is that when you trust God, when you really put yourself in God's hands, then you can depend on God to provide for you. And over and over and over through Scripture, we see that emphasized, that, hey, it doesn't mean that God's going to say, oh, you gave me $1, here's
Yeah.
2 back.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
anybody that does that is a fool.
Yeah.
But I think it does mean that it's an issue of trust for most of us.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, no,
have you-
well, and I just think that people really, as I read that verse and think about that verse, the disposition for those people, just it's not that they're getting back, but they just have a peace about it because they're not trying to control something that's not theirs. And I think where many of us find it is that we're so controlling of our money, controlling of our wealth.
Yeah.
And so we're locked up where
Right.
God is like, and Dave has this great analogy he talks about is that money, people think if they had more money, they'd be more generous. And the truth is, he says, if you have more money, it just makes you more of what you are. And so if you're a
That's
greedy
good.
person and you win a lot, the lottery, you actually will still be a greedy person. And if you're a generous person and you win $1 million, you'll just be a generous person. Like,
No, right.
money doesn't do anything. It's the person and the heart that's behind it. And
yeah,
so,
and generally you don't solve money problems with more money.
no, it just
Right.
just complicates the problem. I mean, because you just have more of stuff now, and then the bills get bigger and different. That's
Right.
all it does. I mean,
Right. Well, and I think at the end of the day, what's really important that we want people at Sea Life to understand is that when the Bible talks about money over and over, and when we teach about it, and we
Yeah.
teach about it not because we really, because generally we're not teaching about it out of need.
Yeah.
I mean, there
Yeah.
are some needs around Sea
Sure.
Life, and we think God wants to do more stuff, and that requires people to be generous and people to give. And we've said it before, God has all the money He needs. He generally chooses to keep it in people's bank accounts.
Yeah.
And so we want people to be generous, but the big reason we want people to be generous, and this is so hard to get across
Yeah.
sometimes, the big reason we want people to be generous is not for God,
Yeah.
because God's
No.
got plenty.
Yeah.
It's not even for the church or for Sea Life, because we believe that God's going to take care of us. But the big reason we want people to be generous is for them.
Yeah.
Because I just think over and over and over the Bible teaches this idea that when you hold on to it and you trust in it,
Yep.
it begins to eat away at
Yeah,
you.
absolutely.
And when you open your hands and let it go,
Yeah.
you discover that, hey, this isn't really what was ever meant to meet
Yeah,
my needs.
that's
And
good.
that really is about God.
Yeah,
And so,
and I think that's so hard for people because it does sound a little bit like a sales pitch. But I'm just telling you, the people that I've met that I think have a great relationship with Christ, they have a great relationship with their spouse. They have just an open countenance to them. They handle their finances the right way.
Yeah,
and that's
good.
And once again, it's to say, listen, if you would just trust us, I'm telling you, a lot of problems exist because we don't have a proper understanding of stewarding God's money well. And so I think it's a
that's good.
struggle for people. And I'm excited about this series because I think more than anything, it's going to free people up to trust God. And I think everybody wants a God story, but we don't want to trust God with a God story.
No, that's awesome.
And so-
Yeah, that's really good. Man,
Yeah.
thank you so much
Yeah,
for
thanks.
helping us, Joe. And we hope you have some great conversation out of this, and we'll see you next week.